Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are on chapter 14, verse 15. We were discussing the Ramban on the pasuk yesterday, that the Jewish people are standing, the Egyptians are on one side, the water's on the other side. The Jewish people, Moshe says, okay, God's going to help us. And God says to Moshe, what are you calling to me for? Tell the Jews to start going. The Ramban has two ideas. One is that what are you crying to me for is not Moshe specifically, it's Jewish people. The second idea the Ramban says is that Moshe was davening for clarity of what to do, and God says, just do it. This is not the time to daven for clarity. And finally, the Ramban also says an idea that God is telling Moshe, why are you leaving the people to daven? This is not the time for them to daven. This is the time for them to go. But of course, it's complicated to understand. What do you mean they shouldn't be davening? And the other thing is, well, if they don't know what to do, why shouldn't they be davening? Okay, so let's see the Sforno. Sforno on Pasuk Tesvav, Ma Titzaki Lai. The Sforno's approach is, Ki Amnam, Hayo Bichlal Vayitzaku V'nei Yisrael Hashem. Similar to what we saw in the Ramban, that when it said the Jewish people cried out to God, Moshe also cried out to God. Amnam, Tzakas Moshe Lo Haisa Miyiras Parav Chil. Whereas the Jewish people were crying out, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? We're goners, what's going to be? Moshe wasn't afraid of Paro. God had told him everything was going to be fine. Kikvar higit Yisrael as mapalas hamitzrim umisasam kamro lo so sifu lirosam odadu lama shamilachim lachem. God says to the Jewish people, this is the last time you're going to see the Egyptians. God's going to fight for you. Sorry, Moshe says to the Jewish people, this is the last time you're going to see the Egyptians. God's going to fight for you. So Moshe's not scared. So then what does it mean that he's doubting Hashem? Kaso al Meri Yisrael. His prayers to God is, how am I going to handle these people? The moment that things aren't going their way, they turned to Moshe and said, what, were there not enough graves in Egypt for you to bring us to the desert? So according to Sforno, Moshe understands, like we see in other Mefarshim, Moshe understands that they're supposed to go into the sea. But he just says, God, they're not going to listen to me. They're already complaining at this moment after everything that's happened already. What in the world am I going to do with these people? So they're davening, God, please save us. Moshe's davening, God, how do I deal with these people? So the Sforno is very interesting shot of the pasuk. So the Sforno says that Hashem then says to Moshe, what are you davening to me for? Ki amnam ata choshed b'ksherim. You are incorrectly skeptical regarding the Jewish people. Dabero b'nei Yisrael v'yiso is how the pasuk continues. Speak to the Jewish people and they'll go. If you tell them to go, they will go. They're not going to rebel against you. So very different perspective on the pasuk. Just to see one more commentary. Orachayim on pasuk Tesvav. Ma titzak elai. Why are you calling to me? Kashe. Ulamul mi yitzak im lo Hashem elokav. Befrat beis tzara. The Orachayim says, what do you mean, why are you calling to me? Who are you supposed to call out to? And this is a time of terrible despair. Why shouldn't they be calling out to God? Right? We have the pasuk in Hallel that from the narrow straits I'll call out to God. That seems to be what we're supposed to do when things aren't going well. Maybe you'll say, okay, you file a request with God, then you move on. Maybe he was davening too much. Guess what? The answer doesn't seem to have come yet. They still don't know what to do. So why not keep on davening? Second point Orachai makes is God tells him, okay, so we're going to stick out your staff and it's going to split the seas. That kind of sounds like his prayers were answered. And so why does Hashem have to say, what are you calling out to me for? Which seems critical of davening. In other words, Hashem could have said, Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yiso, it's time to go. He's seems to be criticizing Moshe for davening. Why are you criticizing Moshe for davening? What was he supposed to do differently? And it sounds like you're answering his prayers. O kasha omro daber b'nei Yisrael v'yiso, leichen yiso. Imrotav me'ocher v'ayam lefneim, v'makavona achashi baka ayam, kein ha'ila lomar haram b'smatcha, v'achri kein yomar, daber b'nei Yisrael. Really, really interesting question. The the Or Chaim poses, which we've sort of been rotating around this question, but I don't think we've ever explicitly asked it. What do you mean tell the Jewish people they should go? Go where? There's nowhere to go. So if the understanding is, no, they should go once the sea splits, well, then you should have flipped the sequence of what you said, because the very next pasuk says, raise your staff and the sea will split. So why doesn't Hashem say to Moshe, what are you crying out to me? Raise your staff and the sea will split, and then tell the Jewish people and they'll go. So there's a lot of confusion in this pasuk, seems to be. Famous medrash that that in heaven the angels were turning to God and saying, why should you save these people? Are they that much better than those Egyptians behind them? The greatest way to evoke divine mercy is good deeds. The more mitzvos we do, the more God will look upon us with mercy. Okay. So now, I just want to skip ahead a little bit. Skipping a few lines. That's what God is saying to Moshe. What are you crying to me for? Perish ki ein hadavar talui biyadi. It's almost like it's out of my hands. I would like to say to Jewish people, but they need to deserve it in some way. They don't really deserve to be saved with a miracle at this point. And I'd love to access mercy, but they need to do good deeds. In other words, there's like two tracks. So one track is, if you deserve it, God gives it to you. Great, they don't fit that. Then there's this mode of, even though you don't deserve it, there are certain things that we can do to arouse mercy. But we need to do things to arouse mercy. So God is saying to Moshe, again, this is not the standard approach at all, but God is saying to Moshe, the magic button is not prayer at this point. This is what you should do to bring out kindness from God, mercy from God. Speak to the Jewish people, let them galvanize themselves with their faith. And they need to set foot into the sea before it splits. I'm going to do a miracle for them. If that they only do something, they give me something to kind of put the miracle on. That is, if they show their faith by walking into that water, even though it hasn't split yet. And that's how it will arouse divine mercy. And only once they start walking in, then stick out your staff. And then that will make the sea split. An interesting way of looking at the pasuk. Then the famous idea that Nachshon ben Aminadav, the tribe of Yehuda, was the first one to go in. And according to at least one rendition of things, the water was up to his neck. So, and that was when the sea split. So that's an interesting idea from the Or Chaim. Okay, let's jump ahead now. Verse 29. Actually, apologize. Let's go to verse 21. Moshe extended his arm on the sea. God brought a wind and made their dry land there. And the sea split. Verse 22. And the Jewish people came through on the dry land. And the water were walls on their right and on their left. Okay, they go through, And then God says to Moshe, extend your staff again, and then the waters close on the Egyptians. Verse 28. Vayashuvu hamayim, the waters came back. They covered up all the Egyptians that came through. No one remained from among the Egyptians. Verse 29. And the Jewish people went on the dry land through the sea. And the water was a wall for them on their right and on their left. Why isn't this a repetition of verse 22? In other words, when the Jewish people walked through, it says, yeah, sea split, the water was walls, fine. Then the Egyptians drowned, and then we said, oh, by the way, we should mention, the waters were dry for the Jews, the sea split, and the waters were walls. We said that already. We know that's what happened for the Jewish people. 29 seems to be a complete repetition of 22. Or Achaim on Pasuk Chavtas, Vnei Yisrael alchu. Tamo doas davar zeh pam sheni. The reason it tells us this a second time. Ulai ki chavin lomar sheyadu hamitzriim es hadavar hazeh ki Yisrael avru bayabasha v'amayim hayu lahem choma v'hem yardu tachtios oretz. It's a really, really interesting thing. The Or HaChaim says, verse 28 is what happened to the Egyptians, right? That's context. The Egyptians drowned in the sea. Verse 29, says the Or HaChaim, is the Egyptians now understood. These Egyptians, as they're drowning, now have an understanding for what happened to the Jewish people. And they understand that this was a miracle just for the Jews. So that this repetition is not the narrator telling us again what happened. It's from the vantage point of the Egyptians. They get it. As they meet their death, they get it. And Or HaChaim says, that's the pshat. If you look back at verse 17, when God tells Moshe what's going to happen, I'm going to strengthen the heart of the Egyptians. They'll come after. And I will become honored through Paro and all of his legions. Verse 18. V'yadu Mitzrayim ki ani Hashem. And the Egyptians will know that I'm God. And by glorifying myself over Paro and his chariots. Which Egyptians will know that I'm God? The Egyptians sitting at home, they're not going to see any of this. So Or HaChaim says, the Egyptians who will be drowned in the sea, they're the ones who'll know. Right before they die, they'll get it. The Or HaChaim says this repetition, seeming repetition, verse 29, is where the Torah is sharing that with us, the perspective of the Egyptians. An interesting shot. So we shared two more ideas as to what God is saying to Moshe, what he's calling out to before, and then we had the Or HaChaim regarding why the pasuk says the second time a description of what happened with the water.